Frame rates have become quite the interesting topic over the last couple of years when it comes to cameras. Today we're going to talk a little bit about different frame rates and how to use them and in what scenarios they work best. What's up guys, my name is Jake Meyer and I'm a video producer in Oklahoma, and this channel is a resource for people who make things, and most specifically people who make videos. And so today we're going to talk about frame rates and what you should use them for, when you should use different ones, and give some practical real world examples of how to use them. Last night I went out to the track with my local running club to film some examples of different frame rates and how you should use them. Now it's important to note that there are going to be different uses for each of these frame rates. And so I'm going to give you a couple tips on what I've found over the last 8 years of making videos that make sense for whenever I'm filming different frame rates. The frame rate that I film most of my videos in is 24 frames per second. That's what looks most natural to me. It's what's been used for a really long time and what a lot of people use all around the world. There are some people who use 30 frames per second, looking at you, MKBHD, but I think that 24 makes more sense for a lot of the work that I do. And so I use 24 frames per second pretty much all the time. I use 60 frames per second only whenever I know that I'm going to slow something down, whether that's that I am slowing it down because my hands are shaky and I need to make it look like the shakiness isn't as prevalent, or if I am trying to get some extra filler shots, or in the rare case, something that I know is going to look way better slowed down than it does in real life. I've really been on a kick the last year of trying to film all of my B-roll and all of my extra footage in real time so that it looks natural whenever everything is seamlessly put together. There's this big notion that slow motion is cinematic, but really, I don't see that. I've tried to watch some more action movies lately, and I've tried to watch some more movies just to see if that actually holds up. And for the most part, what I've found is that slow motion only is used sparingly whenever there's an explosion or there's something really big that happens that needs that extra time and that extra weight to feel emotionally what's going on in the scene. So I use 60 frames per second sparingly, but it's not that I don't use it. So I use 120 frames per second, which would be the next step up for those of us in the US and in North America. And 120 frames per second, I use only sparingly. I don't use it all the time. The only time that I use it is if I know that something calls for extreme slow motion, because 120 frames per second, when played back at 120 frames per second, just looks weird. It looks really smooth, it looks glossy, and it almost looks like a soap opera. Then finally, the last frame rate that I'm testing today is 240 frames per second. 240 frames per second is extreme slow motion. I know there are cameras out there that will shoot 300 frames per second, 960 frames per second, 1,000 frames per second, but I don't have access to any of those. I just have access to a camera that shoots 240 frames per second. So I use that whenever I need something to be extremely slow or for dramatic effect, whether that's water, a drop of water falling into a cup, or whether that is someone running past extremely slowly or an explosion happening. I use 240 frames per second only whenever I need to emphasize details, not for pretty much anything else. I would rather have 120 frames per second than 240 frames per second. The way that I'm interpreting all of the footage for this test today is in a 24 frames per second timeline. Now, that's important because each of these frame rates that I'm shooting in are going to be slowed down to a different percentage of what they would be. The way that this works is you have your 24 frames per second timeline, so each 1 second of a timeline will have 24 individual frames in it. So if you're filming in 240 frames per second, then you have 10 times the amount of frames that a normal 24 frames per second clip has. So theoretically, what you can do is you can slow that down 10 times. And the cool thing about that is that a 1 second clip then becomes a 10-second clip. And then every time you change your frame rate, you have a different conversion rate. So what I like to do is whenever I film in 24 frames per second, I leave it as is. I leave it at 100%. Then whenever I go to 60 frames per second, I slow that down to 40%. I don't want to cut it out, and I don't want to lose frames in the process by slowing it down to 50% or 60 or something like that. Slowing your 60 frames per second clip down in a 24 frames per second timeline gives you about 40% of the speed that you would have if it was a 24 frames clip. Then whenever you're working with 120 frames per second clip, you have 5 times the amount of frames per second that you do as your regular 24 frames per second timeline. That means you can slow down this 120 frames per second clip to 20%, and it will give you 5 times the length that a normal 24 frames per second clip will. So here's an example of some of the clips that I shot last night. I'll list the camera settings on the screen of how I got this exposure and what camera settings I was using. One thing that you'll notice with all of these clips in this first section is that I am doubling the shutter speed. So when I have a clip that I shot in 24 frames per second, then I am putting the shutter speed as close as I can get it to 1/50th per second. So you'll see with this 24 frames per second clip right here, it's playing back in real time what it looked like in real life. And then I doubled the shutter speed to 1/50th of a second. Then whenever I went to 30 frames per second, you can see that it's a little bit smoother and it looks just a little bit more like a news clip. And I changed my shutter speed to 1/60th to accommodate for that. Then whenever I started to film in 60 frames per second, in playing this back at 24 frames per second,
it looks a lot choppier, but as soon as I slow it down, then you see that it looks a lot smoother because it's playing back and not cutting out any extra frames.
So I slowed this clip speed down to 40%, and that is making this clip longer than it would be if it was just playing out in real life. But because I'm filming with these extra frames per second, then I have the ability to do that, and it doesn't look choppy, it doesn't look strange, it doesn't look like it's unnatural. Then whenever you see this 120 frames per second clip, you'll see that it is really, really smooth, especially when played back in this timeline, but also doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense because it's hyper smooth. It's overly realistic. Then whenever you look at this 240 frames per second clip, it really doesn't look right. Something's just off about this. So with this first section of clips, you'll see that the motion blur should look the same for each clip, even though they're filmed in different frames per second. Now I have this test where I changed the shutter speed. And so I tried to do it where I changed the shutter speed for 24 frames per second for 30, 60, 120, and 240, where I would quadruple the shutter speed. So with this 24 frames per second clip, I filmed in I think it was 1/100th shutter speed, and you can see how choppy this looks. It doesn't look natural. If I pause the frame right here, you'll see that there's not this nice natural motion blur. It's actually really sharp. This is a really good technique if you are shooting sports or if you're shooting something that needs a jittery feel, maybe like an action scene or maybe something that you want to feel frantic. What matters with shutter speed is that you are doing what makes sense for your scene. You're doing what makes sense for your specific use case. One thing that I found working with different shutter speeds and different kinds of subjects is that shutter speed is not a rule, it's a guideline. I try to film everything with the 180-degree shutter rule, which states that you should double your shutter speed based on the frame rate that you're working in. And I like doing that because I think it makes sense for a lot of different pieces of filmmaking. If I were to wave my hand in front of my face right here, you would see this nice natural motion blur. But if I crank up the shutter speed, then it's not going to look quite natural. So let me go ahead and do that. All right, let's take the shutter speed to 1/125th, and we'll adjust my ND filter. You can see how choppy this looks, and if I pause it right here, then you're still going to hear my voice, but you'll see that my hand, it doesn't quite look right. So I'm going to go back to normal now. One way. Okay, there we go, that looks better. If you're filming sports or if you're filming a scene where something needs to feel frantic, people need to feel a bit uncomfortable watching this, or you need them to be on the edge of their seat, then I would change the shutter speed, and I would make the shutter speed faster where you're shooting it 1/100th of a second, 1/125th, something like that. everything that you're filming is not really dictated by any rules unless it's rules by your client, in which case you should probably listen to those. But shutter speed is just a guideline. Same thing with aperture, same thing with ISO. What makes the most sense to me is to usually film at a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second, because that's what matches up with my frame rates. But that's not always how it's going to work. Sometimes you might need something jittery, sometimes you might need something slower. Watch this, if I change my shutter speed where it's even slower, where I'm at 1/10th of a second, look at what happens to my mouth. And look at what happens to my motion. It looks like it's super unrealistic and kind of like you've been dazed and confused and you don't know what's going on. I'm gonna go back to normal now. But you'll see that that's a different kind of effect. I'll use some of that if there's a lot of lights and I want to capture these cool light trails, or if I'm in a moving car and I want to make it seem like time is passing but very, very slowly. Might change my shutter speed where it's slower than the frames per second that I'm capturing. Everything in filmmaking is relative. There are no rules. Just go out and do whatever makes sense for your project that you're working on right now. That's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you guys enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and like this video. And I will catch you guys next time.